Welcome back to Cultures Campus, how the industry keeps beating. I want to remind all of you that we actually have the official hashtag of the conference, and it's Cultures Campus 2020. So please, I hope that my tech team colleagues can put it to the chat right now so that we can make sure that everyone can post anything they want about this conference on social media, Instagram, Facebook, whatever. We even have Twitter. So I'm also very excited to announce that all our sessions are being watched closely by an outstanding artist, Michelle Buchholz, and she is Wet Sweden and lives on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh Coast Salish peoples, or Vancouver, BC. She's creating a visual recording of the sessions, which will be shared after the conference. Now, we are ready to move to our next session. I'm excited to introduce 4 awesome speakers for the next presentation, Accessibility Online. Jaclyn Qua-Hiansen is the Senior Coordinator, Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Accessibility at the Royal Ontario Museum. She works with over 100 communities partners to facilitate inclusive and welcoming experiences at the Rome. She also coordinates accessibility for some of the Rome's exhibitions. Shawn Newman is the Research and Impact Manager at Toronto Arts Council and Toronto Arts Foundation. In this role, he leads all research, impact, and program evaluation projects for TAG grant programs and foundation initiatives. He holds a PhD in cultural studies and has had an international career as a dancer and choreographer. Rozeboom has over 25 years experience in the nonprofit art sector as a fundraiser, communication specialist, artist, and administrator. Since 2017, she has acted as the executive director of Tangled Art Plus Disability, a group boldly redefining how the world experiences art and those who create it by supporting deaf, mad, and disability-identified artists, cultivating disability arts in Canada, and enhancing access to the arts for artists, audiences, and enthusiasts. Heidi Persaud is an event coordinator for Tangled Art Plus Disability. Her interests focus on arts administration and accessible event planning. Heidi holds a BFA and a postgraduate certificate in arts administration and cultural management. Good choice, good choice. She's currently a member of the Visual and Digital Arts Art Foundation Program Advisory Committee at Humber College. And last but not least, Lindsay Fisher is the founder and director of Creative Futures Projects, a disability-led national arts service organization working on connecting communities, cultivating inclusion, and making difference discoverable and vital in a world that's transforming to digital. She has a background working in the arts sector as a multidisciplinary artist and curator. So please welcome Jaclyn, Shawn, Sin, Heidi, and Lindsay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mikita. I'm Shawn Newman. I'm actually going to be kind of moderating, even though, you know, there's a particular power dynamic with that term. So thank you for the introduction. That actually saves me a lot of time from having to do all that, but I think we will just go around quickly in a moment. I just wanted to thank you, everyone, for attending today. And on behalf of my fellow panelists, we are very grateful to be invited to speak about accessibility and to be part of this conference. I also feel it's important to really acknowledge that I'm broadcasting to you live, crowdcast from, as Indigenous dance artist Brian Solomon notes, the unceded territories of Zoom. And also that to really recognize that in being in where I am in Toronto, which is historical and contemporary lands of various Indigenous folks and nations and communities, including the Wendat, the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. I feel it's important to not just give an acknowledgement of the lands, and for the conference as a whole, but also to this particular session, because one of the things that land acknowledgements do is they really highlight the notion of access to space. And the colonial context in which we are situated in many ways presumes a right to access and a right to space. And so there are so many links and commonalities between Indigenous communities and disabled communities. And those two categories and communities are not always mutually exclusive. And so we really want to think about the ways that access to space is often seen as a right of a particular group of people. And if as a right, it then means that others are not afforded that right. So I really want us to understand that the land acknowledgements are not just a performative act, but they actually really prompt us to think specifically about our relations to power and our relations to privilege and marginalization. So our session today is going to be really just a discussion. The five of us met last week to have a discussion about some of the ideas and things that we wanted to talk about. And so we've got some ideas and some questions that I'm going to put forward to the group. There is a Q&A session, as was said in the intro, at the end. But if anything comes up in the moment that it needs clarification, we're happy to respond to that. And so I'm just going to, we're also going to try to give some descriptions of ourselves, some physical descriptions. I am a white man, I have a beard and glasses, and I haven't had a haircut in months, so I'm kind of going for a Farrah Fawcett look that I think is working in my favor. I am wearing a black V-neck long sleeve t-shirt that I really love, and admittedly, the lighting in my place is not the best. I gesture a lot when I speak. As was mentioned, I was a dancer and a choreographer, so physicality is very important to my being, so I apologize if it is distracting to anyone. And with that, I pass it to Jaclyn.
Hi, thank you, Shawn. So I'm Jaclyn from the ROM, and just a quick description of myself. I'm a Filipino Chinese woman with shoulder-length black hair and a bright pink top with black tiger stripes. And passing it on to Sin.
Hi, my name is Sin. I am a middle-aged woman with dirty blonde long hair with lots of gray streaks, blue eyes. I'm wearing a blue flouncy kind of shirt, and I'm sitting in my backyard in front of a very leafy, viney fence right now. And I will pass it to Lindsay.
Hi, Shawn. My name is Lindsay Fisher from Creative Fusions, and I am white, female presenting person with long, frizzy, curly black hair, and I'm wearing a black tank top. And I'm sitting on the floor in my living room, which is a mess. And I'll pass it to Heidi.
Hello, I'm Heidi Persaud from Tangled Art Plus Disability. I'm a South Asian of Guyanese descent, female identified. I have medium brown, curly, wild hair right now, and the bushiest of eyebrows you'll ever see. I'm wearing a beige crocheted top, and yeah, I have brown eyes. Yeah.
Thank you, everyone. So I'm just going to give some additional thoughts before we move into the broader discussion, just to help, I think, frame not just accessibility in the ways that we see it, but to also kind of bring the five of us, kind of back to maybe our discussion from last week. But also as a way to for the audience, how we, as individually, but also possibly collectively think of accessibility. So, I sort of gestured to the ways that, accessibility really is a reflection of who belongs in a space. And in the context of this panel, space is also a digital space, right? We can think about space in terms of environment, but space also brings us to think about certainly in my role at Toronto Arts Council, in a funding program, right? Or in foundation in a community initiative. And we also, but conventionally, and in many, many important ways, accessibility is often thought of in terms of disability, and this is certainly integral and foundational. And the movement for accessibility in many, many ways now, right, really had its start in disability justice. And what we're seeing in the turn to the digital is a move towards finally, in many important ways, starting to incorporate and really understand the importance of that. But at the same time, and I think especially now, in terms of not just the pandemic, but also the protests towards confronting anti-Black racism and other forms of oppression, really what these are also seeking is accessibility, right? Into our social structures, into our political spheres, into cultural communities. And yet accessibility is frequently thought of, particularly on the part of organizations, but even as in terms of society, as an addendum, right? The ways that accessibility has been legislated in many parts of the country and the world, because it comes from a disability perspective, but then it's thought of as we create the thing, and then we try to think about how to make it accessible. So we're really wanting to push the notion that accessibility from the ground up means that it actually, you are working towards supporting everyone, that it's not about it's not about creating a thing and then trying to figure out how to make it adaptable. That if you build accessibility into the thing, it will be adaptable. One of the other things that we've seen in this pandemic, right, is that in terms of thinking about accessibility, and is that social distancing, right, has meant, as Sin, you had said last week in our discussion, that it's prompting us to think about people in people first, and in quote unquote new ways. And I say new within quotation marks because it's not new to some of us. It is new to many of us. But again, disability justice and disabled communities have been really pushing for this for a long time. The digital, which is kind of the focus of this conference, has in many ways, has long been an enabling mechanism. But this is not to say that it just is. It also presents particular barriers and in some ways exacerbates already existing barriers. So we really want to be attentive to the nuances of what the digital offers, and not just accepting it as this wonderful, beautiful, utopian accessibility tool. When with the outset of the pandemic, when we saw so many educational institutions moving their educational platforms online, there was many discussions about how now education is available to everyone. And that's just not true. One example being, there are many communities in Canada that do not have access to internet or broadband internet. And again, here's a connection between disability, accessibility, and Indigenous communities. Many of those communities that lack internet are Indigenous. So what we're seeing now is a sudden centering of accessibility in many parts of the arts and culture sector where it had previously been only marginalized. And the last thing I want to say before moving into the discussion is that thinking through accessibility reveals underlying assumptions about who the audience or consumer is, right? So if we're thinking about the product or thing that we're creating, and we get feedback that certain people are not invited or welcomed into it, then it's telling us who we are imagining this person to be, or this group of people to be. And that's a really, really important piece that arts organizations in particular, I think, need to really start thinking about and be attentive to. So I just want to now turn it over to the group. So with the focus on the digital, and the idea that there are particular barriers or additional concerns, with the sudden shift to the digital in arts and culture, what changes the dynamic between accessibility and disability are you seeing, or is there any? What is this shift to digital for arts and culture doing to disabled artists, audiences, consumers? Sin.
I don't have a full answer, but I will mention one of the things about these digital spaces that we're now inhabiting. Often it does remove or lessens a lot of the physical barriers for people who might have, might be at the the mercy of, say, wheel-trans or whatever. That is just one type of barrier, though, and it doesn't, I think the digital space doesn't solve all of them, but that is certainly a big one. At Tangled Art Plus Disability, we have a number of wheelchair users on our board. Suddenly the board is able to meet in a way that they were not unable to before. I'm going to
So when I work at the ROM, one of the things I always ask myself whenever we put something on is who is unable to access this content. And I think the knee-jerk reaction is, the first thing we think of is really the physical barriers to access. In your introduction, Shawn, you brought up some very important other barriers we should also be considering, like even if it's all physically accessible, do people feel welcome in the space? Can people do people have the financial means to have broadband internet that won't cut out, or to be in a space where they won't be distracted by all sorts of other things going on in a house. And so I think digital media does help address some of those things, at least from a welcome and inclusion perspective. It removes the barrier of being in a space and feeling like you don't belong. If you've ever been to like a really fancy place and you're like the only one not in a gown or something, you're like, am I supposed to be here? Is it really for me? Whereas if you're in your own home and everyone's just in their pajamas, it's fine, right? But my concern really with this shift to digital and all these conversations about accessibility is that we will look at this and say, now we're accessible, pat ourselves in the back, bam, everything's fixed. And that's not going to be the case. And moving forward, once we start being able to enter these physical spaces again, will digital platforms still be a priority? Will it still be a platform that we're going to be using on an ongoing basis? I'm always cautious about arts organizations and people in general congratulating ourselves on on progress that we make, because I find that tends to limit further progress. So yeah, it's a very, I think, complicated and complex space we're in right now, where there's so much potential to start actually looking at this platform and thinking about all the potential features that will make our content even more accessible to a greater variety of folks, without taking it for granted that we are accessible and inclusive.
Sorry, am I unmuted?
You're good.
I'm sorry to butt in ahead of you there, Heidi, but just want to echo what you just said. There's like, I think it's a danger to think that accessibility is a static space that we can ever reach. That's never going to happen. I don't believe there's any space that will be fully accessible to all people all the time. It's a moving target that we have to negotiate. It's more of an attitude, I think, and that's something that we have to embrace as something that we negotiate as we move forward. Because yeah, you don't just get there and it's done. That's just that's not accessibility, not to me. Heidi, did you want to talk?
Yeah, I was going to agree with Jaclyn and what she said about in regards to the digital sphere. When I think about it, I'm always thinking about this user experience in either real life or even on a digital platform. And I think one thing that the arts is gonna really have to think about is how our user experience is, or how we are portraying the user experience, or allowing access to be a part of the user experience, whether it's the amount of content that we put on in regards to images. Yeah, now that we are online, and it is technically accessible for all, it's not necessarily accessible for a variety of people. And whether or not we're going to have these conversations with communities and to including communities into these conversations is one thing that we should be really thinking about.
And kind of jumping off what you said, Heidi, about the user experience, I completely agree, because one of my fallbacks, I think, when I think about accessibility for exhibitions at the ROM, for example, is being able to engage as many senses as possible. So even if someone can't physically see an exhibition, they can at least touch things. Or if people, people learn best through hearing, maybe that's a feature of the exhibition that will help bring the experience closer to them. And I'm very conscious about the limits of the digital space. Even now, we've described ourselves, we're talking, but if we were giving some kind of visual presentation, how many of these kinds of events would take the time to actually describe each and every object as we go up, as it's put on screen. And I'm just thinking, and again, I'm like thinking about all these folks who, maybe learn best through touch, through haptic experiences. And this is something that the digital space currently doesn't offer. So yeah.
Yeah, that's great. And actually, Jaclyn, there's something you said earlier that I really loved about being in your pajamas. And we're all, now at home, and there are things that I think, there's a real sense now, I think, in a lot of organizations where people are more welcome to be just more comfortable in their homes and comfortable. It's challenging notions of professionalism, right, that are so built upon ableist mechanisms and so many other forms of whiteness and all of those kinds of things. And so this shift to digital is really, in some ways, right, allowing us to be more understand people as more holistic beings than just the sort of the work kind of capacity, right? I'm interested in how the shift to digital too is, because so much of it, of course, now is building on accessibility. Where are disabled folks in relation to this conversation? Since, are they being centered? Are they being left out? Is the work, what are the dynamics there? Lindsay, yeah.
Yeah, I was saying, it's interesting because I think this digital shift already happened, in many ways for many different people who were, I love this, thinking about people with disabilities as life hackers, and really looking at the disability justice movement and disability arts practice, and how people with disability are already using these technologies, or how they've been using these technologies for years. I know Tangled and the work that we do, and I'm sure the ROM, that live streaming has always been a part of our access budget for not always, but for a long time, and it's always been considered an access entry point. And so it's what's surreal is that, and what I'm hearing from other people in the community is that now you don't have to convince anybody or any organization how important live streaming is to access the arts now. And so I think there's a concern that that conversation is now mainstream, and yet people with disabilities are still not being invited to those conversations, and they're still being left out of those conversations. Yeah, so I feel like this is a real opportunity to acknowledge that these practices and technologies have already been being used in this way, and that we could perhaps take a pause to learn and be guided by people with disabilities and the ways that they're doing things, so that in order to rebuild going forward. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that points to a really interesting idea. I had a conversation with a colleague just yesterday at Ryerson who is a business management person. He doesn't work in and through accessibility, but he talked about innovation happens on the margins, right? How innovation doesn't happen in the mainstream. And I said to him, I'm so glad to hear that you understand that, because guess what? That's exactly what accessibility and disabled folks are talking about, right? And so folks who are already situated on the margins, right, are having to do this work of hacking life, of adapting to disabling environments. And so what are the things that are already in place, that are already being practiced? And yet, as Lindsay's saying, why are those folks now not centered in terms of leading the mainstream, conversation or practice? There wasn't really a question in that, but I guess the kind of, building off of that is because of now this mainstream shift towards accessibility in the digital, we've seen, certainly in the arts and culture industries, just an explosion in the number of events, of projects, of things going online, and which, is at once both really exciting, but also kind of can be stressful, right? Like there's so much to go and see and all happening simultaneously. So I'm wondering, are there issues that arise with this kind of influx of content?
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on this in our discussion last week, is that it can be overwhelming. It's just this sensory overload, and there's like a weird digital FOMO now. Like, we have 1,000 events all happening tonight. Can we get to them all? And now we don't have an excuse not to get to them because they're all here on our couch. And it's exciting in one hand because suddenly we have access to all sorts of content that we didn't have before. Like I got to watch an opera at the Met, which I've never done before because it was expensive and it's in New York, and now it's free and on my laptop. It's exciting, and at the same time, it's overwhelming, but it's also in a way allowing us, I think, to engage with content on our own time. So a lot of these live streamed activities are often archived to be able to view later on. So like Stratford, for example, its plays are up for an entire month after their big live streaming. And that increases accessibility for events in a way, because if you're not feeling up to joining an event one evening, you have a whole week or a whole month to enjoy it. Or if you're busy and you can only attend 2 out of the 10 events all going on one night, you can kind of space it out. So, it's interesting to see how this, I think, will be carried. This form of accessibility will be carried forward when we start returning to physical events. When we might still have these live stream digital events, but because the pandemic is over, we're starting to have in-person events again. And it's like, how do we kind of continue to provide this kind of access and allow people to experience content and experience socialization with our spaces on their own time?
One thing that concerns me about this proliferation of all this is that it's still relegating most of us to being consumers of culture instead of active participants in creating it. And I think that there's an underlying assumption there that I would love to see challenged somewhat in our society, that we don't always need to be producing stuff for other people to consume. Somehow, especially with arts professionals, the idea is that you have to make stuff and that's how you validate yourself. You make something that's brilliant and then everybody will applaud you because you're great, but we all are creators of this culture together. And I think that we need time to actually bring ourselves to the conversation and change things around us. And that might, when we're just sort of bombarded with stuff coming at us, we're not necessarily expressing and integrating ourselves sort of bottom up instead of like just having it all falling on us if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I touched on this last time we had this conversation, but I did feel quite overwhelmed when everything was starting up and that people were just posting a lot of events of what's going on online now that we're not doing it physically. I felt like the content was heavily overloaded, and that that this would have been a good time to just take a break and to really reevaluate what works and what doesn't work, and what we can do to maybe accommodate artists in general, and how do we just make things be a little bit more easier for us, or just to accommodate us in general. But it felt like I had to be always online, and made me question whether or not my graphics card is strong enough for the sheer amount of things that I want to do.
Yeah, for sure. And Sin has just brought her cat to the meeting, everyone. So I want to thank you for that, because you can never have too many cats in your life, I have to say. So this, I think this is really interesting, what you're all speaking to, because with the proliferation of content, you know, Jaclyn, what you were speaking to really, and the notion that we can just engage on our own time, right, really disrupts a lot of the sort of pressure that we saw pre-COVID, and certainly are at risk of trying to return to, in terms of needing to be productive and fast-paced and, you know, all the time. And it's allowing us to really think about time differently, and how we spend it and how we behave in it. But and then Sin, with what you were saying too, like thinking about the proliferation of content that is available, you know, is this, with organizations and even individuals offering all of this up, right? Is it offered up as a way, in terms of providing options, which from an accessibility perspective is important, right? We want to, accessibility is really about allowing the individual to have options and agency, but is the expectation or the push to deliver content actually about trying to retain discoverability, right? Or retain an audience, and really actually recentering the organization's need to quote unquote be relevant?
Yeah, and also, Shawn, thank you for saying that. And what has been disappointing for me is, with creative users, is before COVID, we were our primary activity is researching events happening across Canada that are accessible to deaf communities, blind communities, and neurodivergent communities. And so we had to shift when COVID happened to keep up with all the new sort of format of activity. But we didn't find that things, like, even though things are accessible now through online, they're not actually accessible to deaf communities. They're not accessible to blind communities. They're not necessarily accessible to neurodivergent. I mean, in many ways, not just because there isn't ASL interpretation or audio description, or but who is organizing those events and who are being represented in those events are not representative of those communities. So it was, you know, at the beginning, it was hopeful that this is a new day, but I'm feeling like it's been frustrating, actually, trying to find those things that are happening to connect people to them, and then to find out what people are doing, like to remind people that yeah, there are these communities that actually can't, even though they're online, they can't access them. So I think that relates to this feeling of, like, yeah, the speed that we're doing things, we're not actually taking the time to think about who are we prioritizing here, and who are we leaving out.
And again, Lindsay, that comes right back to, you know, sort of the idea that it reveals underlying assumption the consumer or the audience is, right?
Yeah.
And it also, I think, kind of speaks to what does happen often in throughout human history, where like the dominant culture appropriates the work that's been done by, by marginalized folks, and it's and we talk about accessibility. We talk about using all of these innovations, these platforms that disabled folks have been using for a long time because they're like life hacks in a disabling world. But the reality is that a lot of the current digital platform still centers the abled user. You know, when people talk about let's put our things online, it's not the conversation isn't so much about so that disabled folks and deaf folks can actually access it. It's still so that all these able-bodied users who've been physically coming to our space can still access our content. So you're right, Shawn, and you're absolutely right, Lindsay, in saying that that disabled folks are still left in the margins, and that a lot of moving content online is still about remaining relevant in in the currently COVID world. And it's and maybe that's why I'm concerned that moving forward, once you start moving back to like physical spaces and everything, that a lot of these innovations will just be tossed aside because now it's like, oh, okay, we can go back to business as usual because our usual audience can access our content again in the old ways. Um, yeah, and I think that kind of, and I was just thinking about what you said, Sen, about how we're still expected to be consumers of culture rather than active participants. I think there is space for the digital platform to allow for greater participation from various audiences. I don't know if it will actually be a priority to explore that kind of potential, or if organizations will just be satisfied with here it is, we're keeping our content available in a digital space while COVID's going on. That would be awesome. Like, I'm thinking about like these physical like community murals, for example, that bring people together and get everyone, a whole group of folks together for like communal art making. And if there's a way to do that in a digital space and figure something out, I don't know, but it'll be awesome.
Yeah, Lindsay?
Has anybody heard of the Dolly Parton Choir?
I want to now.
Great way, a great activity to participate in. It happens every year, and they're doing it online, so it'll be interesting.
I'm writing that down to look at. So we've got some questions kind of rolling in, but before we turn to those, I just kind of want to ask sort of one last question, because, with this discussion around, the sort of the mainstreaming and yet continued marginalization, mainstreaming of accessibility, but continued marginalization of disabled folks. So is like, is accessibility now sexy in a way that maybe it wasn't before? And do you have examples of this, and what does this say about our pre-COVID BC, before COVID society? And also I'm interested to know if you think that publics, policymakers and politicians are picking up on this, or if it's actually something that seems maybe to resonate a bit more deeply than just being this sexy thing.
I don't know if it's sexy, but the word one thing I really noticed, and Shawn, I'm referring to a question that you actually haven't asked yet, so I'm gonna go to that. But just seeing evidence of like disability justice work and arts practice into the sort of arts world, I'm seeing exciting happening on social media is that in the midst of this rapid amount of information related to justice work on anti-Black racism and the pandemic, I'm seeing people online really collaborating and forming volunteer collectives to advocate for like more captioned content, for example. So there's actually groups online that are basically volunteering their time to make all this content accessible. I think that's pretty sexy. And yeah, we could follow that example, you know. Are we doing this because it's for economic reasons or because it's a checkbox? Or are we doing it because we're actually, like you said, we're imagining that people need this information, they need to access it, to be a part of that conversation, be a part of that change.
Yeah. I just want to say, like, I think of sexiness as like something that's flashy and kind of, you know, du jour, but also there can be something very authentic about it, right? And very real.
I think this pandemic is making us rethink what accessibility means for our organizations, and whether that translates into lawmakers actually starting to mandate some of these things stay constant is a whole different discussion. My sense is because they're more focused now on like opening things up and rebuilding businesses and everything, that it probably won't be a sexy priority for them longer term. But for individual institutions, at least individual organizations, it's definitely something we need to work through. So at the ROM, like, you know, my go-to for accessibility in exhibitions has always been touching things, like offering things for people to touch, because then that makes things more accessible and more fun. And that won't work in a post-COVID world. So, you know, so starting to think about, all right, how do we actually make things accessible in a different way, right? Or all our conversations now about how digital content is accessible in some ways, but not accessible in other ways. Like, how do we keep moving these kinds of innovations forward and make it accessible? And these are questions that I think are more of concern to individual institutions, because I think it'll be very different for each institution depending on their kind of content.
I think I think accessibility right now is a bit, it can be used as a bit of a buzzword in terms of something that we societally have agreed that is desirable, but not always are people, I guess the worry is that it becomes something, again, that feels like it's a bunch of check boxes and that you do it and it happens, as opposed to an attitude and a spirit of wanting to open your space and include people, which is a lot harder to share. Or, you know, I find sometimes people are all about access until the reality of what that actually means hits them in the face, and all of a sudden it's like, well, I don't mean access, like I don't want to do that, you know, that's inconvenient, or that's, you know, that's not how I envisioned this to be, which gets in the way. I had another thought, but I've lost it, so I'm gonna stop.
Heidi, you look like you're about to say something.
No, I was really thinking about it, and I'm like, you know what, access is kind of sexy, but like, you know, it is. But no, I was joking around about that. But I was thinking that it is being used as a buzzword in regards to, I don't know, I see it sometimes, like, or I hear it being thrown around a lot. But if the intention and the sincerity isn't there, then there's a lot to be questioned in regards to why, you know, like, or how, or if it's just, I don't know, I'm just thinking about it really hard. But I don't know, when I think about it, I think the authenticity of access is something that we should be thriving for. Yeah.
I'll jump on that too, and also kind of relating to one of the questions here about the in the chat here about budgeting. I think the authenticity is that's really key. It's if you actually commit to bringing people into your space, that should drive what you spend money on, and you should commit to that. I think it's really about a priority thing. If you say we want to engage deaf, hard of hearing individuals, then you have to think long term and realize that there's so many years of distrust and broken promises and people who will do a one-off thing and never follow through, which just increases the sense of that you're just tokenized. So yeah, but if you start with the intention and go from there, that's like the most important thing, which doesn't help maybe, but it's the truth.
Yeah, so sorry, I just want to jump in quickly. Just the question that Sin's talking about is from Kyla. Do you have any tips for arts organizers trying to balance their expenses related to programming with offering accessibility services such as ASL interpreters, live closed captioning, or braille printing? Sometimes the expense can be prohibitive given the limited budgets some are working with. And one thing that I just want to add, Sin, sorry, Heidi and Jaclyn, before you I'm just going to add it in, is that it actually, to me, is actually a question of values as an organization, because is actually the directive to just be delivering information or content or, you know, or say number of events versus actually making sure that the people, that it's about the people you are reaching. And yes, in our current context, there are costs often associated with it, with accessibility, but part of that stems from the fact that often these projects or initiatives are not built up from an accessibility perspective. And frequently trying to make something accessible that wasn't designed accessibly is actually far more expensive than actually just doing it at the outset. And in terms of nonprofits, right, especially when it becomes a matter of, like, if you rely on grants and all of that kind of thing, really trying to embed those in the operational costs, right? Which is different if you operate on a project funding basis, but when they become part of your operational costs, then within the context of annual operating funding, right, that's a legitimate business expense, right? From my perspective, I'm not necessarily speaking as a TUC employee here, by the way, I'm just making the case. So yeah, I really think that it has to do with values. And if the value really is about reaching people rather than the action of delivering content, then I think that can help to kind of rethink the concerns around finances. Sorry, Heidi, Jaclyn.
Yeah, Shawn, I absolutely agree with you on that. It's really when you find your values and when you work with them, it starts to go into place. And even when you start to invite these people, inviting people to the conversation in regards to doing, asking for consultation and finding out from various groups of how to create more accessible events or how to bring people into or to open up the space for a wider audience is an important way of thinking about it. Yeah.
I was just thinking that, Shawn, your earlier question about lawmakers now find accessibility sexy actually could help with that, because, you know, I completely agree with, you know, with values and with making things with the audiences in mind. But I also acknowledge that there are lots of financial limitations, and at the end of the day, it's like, how do we put things on at the least cost for it to reach the greatest number of folks? And it's, I think that's where lawmakers can come in. And, you know, we've seen the things that have changed and that have improved ever since the AODA came on board. And it's not that things are perfect right now, but there are some accessibility accommodations that probably, you know, might still be very far back if it's not a legal issue, right? And with regard to, I think, balancing expenses for organizations with very limited budgets, I find that my personal approach, at least, is to find hacks wherever you can. So having braille labels might be really, really prohibitive, and, you know, might be too outside your budget. But maybe you can record, I don't know, someone reciting the labels out loud and stick it on or something. And it's not the best way, but, you know, but it's there's always ways of, I think, skirting around things. And certainly, if you start designing your project from the get-go with accessibility in mind, you won't have to worry about these kinds of things as much later on, and will hopefully, like, make things cheaper for you.
And Jaclyn,
Sorry.
sorry, Sin.
It comes back to, again, I think, to the priority of it. I mean, but access can be expensive, but if you prioritize, any access budget that I work on, our budgets will go anywhere from 10% of our budget to 25% of our budget to be spent on access. That's because that's so integrated into the Tangled Arts mandate, obviously. If you as an organization or an individual say, I'm going to prioritize this, you have to be able to say, okay, I'm going to set this aside and just, I'm going to make that a priority. Like, budgets are always flexible. There's something, you choose one thing over another. But I think but to be honest about your true values as well, you might not be in a situation where you can accommodate everybody or all the things that you want to do, in which case maybe look at what you can do and go there first and then build on that. I think it's more important to be committed and look the long term rather than trying to do a big flashy show and do everything all at once. That's going to fail.
Yeah, and actually, Sin, that's really speaking to what I was going to say, and kind of thinking through what Jaclyn said, and it come up before you kind of throughout this talk also, like, accessibility is not necessarily or always just about the perfect fix, right? Accessibility is about lessening barriers. So like Jaclyn was saying, maybe, an audio recording is not the best fix, right, for everyone, but it's a fix for some people. And so what are the ways that your organization or your project can be working towards a quote unquote fully accessible kind of mandate, recognizing that there are many steps along the many different ways that we can lessen the barriers. If we try to think about the sort of quote unquote right answer, right, then we think in a really binary oppositional way, and there are a whole bunch of options in between that actually still are good moves, right? So I'm just going to return to some of the questions. So Maria is asking, I work with seniors, some of whom don't have digital access because they don't want it. Are we obligated to engage them? I find that they feel worse knowing that others are active in online activities.
Short answer, yes. I think you are obligated to reach seniors and folks who don't have digital access. I don't think that you need to use digital content to reach them necessarily. And I think this is where, what you were talking about earlier about thinking about your audience comes into play. So it's like, all right, we have all this wonderful digital content going on. Like, what do we do for folks who aren't on digital platforms, who don't have an iPad or don't know how to work a laptop? And that's actually something that I've been thinking about when everything was like moving online, is that a lot of seniors who don't have digital access may not also be able to have close contact with people who would usually be able to help them like access this digital content. Because I think it's usually like a family member, a personal support worker could usually be like, here's your laptop, here's how we can look at this digital thing together. But because of COVID, they would be limited in that. And I think there are other ways to engage with them. And I saw was it Workman Arts who sent these art supplies in little Ziploc bags to CAMH, so that they can CAMH patients can do art activities even with social distancing. So there are always workarounds, and I like using workarounds because that's how we engage as many different audience members as possible.
Heidi, again, it looks like you're maybe going to speak. Am I correct or no? No, okay. So just in the interest of time, I'd like, there are two more questions submitted by Kristen and Shaheen, and I'm going to try and tie them together actually. So Kristen is asking, in what ways can we encourage businesses and organizations to continue these online ways to engage and allow people to help co-create those experiences rather than consumers of it? And Shaheen, what is one concrete step that organizations can take right now to quote unquote bring disabled folks to the table? And I just, I see connections between these two questions, because co-creating, right, is actually one way of bringing people to the table. So I wonder if we can maybe think about and talk to, if you could speak to this idea of encouraging businesses and organizations to work from a co-creation model instead of a service model, providing something to people and community without actually allowing them to be part of the design matrix, I guess.
I would say that we take advantage of this opportunity where we've had to slow down in many ways, and I feel like it's pretty simple. Like, just start talking to people and start like connecting with people who you haven't before COVID. You never had, either you didn't have the time or you weren't prioritizing those people, but now is the time to reach out and to expand the people that you're creating with, or that you're having conversations with. I mean, I know myself, creative users, we're trying to do that as well, and it's a really exciting time to be connecting with people, because there's so many stories and experiences that people are really eager to share, and that will really help inform what you want to do, going forward. So, yeah.
So,
Like,
sorry, go on.
have a focus group online, and invite people.
So one thing that's really helped us at the ROM, at least, is our partnerships with a whole bunch of community organizations, and a lot of these partners are really generous with their time and their lived experiences and their expertise in giving us feedback when we ask for it. So we're like, so I've reached out to some of them, been like, here's an exhibition you want to do. Here's one of the things you want to do with it. I realize that this could be a barrier for your audiences. How do we fix this? And a lot of the time it's a quick phone call that helps us understand better how to make things more accessible. And I mean, in terms of one concrete step that organizations can take, if there's capacity, if there's opportunities, it'll be great to hire disabled folks to do things, whether it's sitting in a department that actually makes decisions on how to create accessible content, or whether it's bringing them in as artists or creators or something to produce this content in an accessible way. Like, if that's something that is a possibility, it's always great to start breaking down these systemic barriers and really starting to change from the inside out.
Mm-hmm. We're just about out of time. I just wanted to also just throw out the idea too that that it's important, right, if in seeking community and seeking folks to co-create with, that there be some preparatory work done in advance, right? That it's not about turning to people to say, teach me. We are in a digital age. There are lots of resources out there that you can use. approach community with a, hey, this is what we've learned on our own, and this is what we're thinking. So what are your thoughts? Because when you turn to marginalized folks as the first point of contact, it reproduces the notion that they have to do all the work. And it will actually be so much more beneficial for you and your organization if you are able to initiate that work yourself and bring people in to then develop things together. I think that that's probably all the time we have. So thank you, everyone. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you, Humber. I hope that this has been great and exciting and interesting. And please, you know, reach out. I'm happy to receive any inquiries from anyone in the who's attending. Forward anything on to my colleagues here if needed.
Thank you so much. Thank all of you guys, Jaclyn, Shawn, Lindsay, Sin, Heidi. It was a very sexy conversation. Thank you so much. And now we're going to have a short 15 minutes break. So we're gonna